Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Director of Artist and Studio Programs here at Baltimore Clayworks, and we are thrilled that you all have joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my office located on Piscataway and Susquehannock land, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Shalya Marsh. Shalai is an artist and educator based in Morgantown, West Virginia. Originally from upstate New York, she holds a BFA in ceramics from the State University of New York at New Paltz and an MFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, earned in 2016. Her work has been featured in numerous solo and group exhibitions across the United States. With over 2 decades of experience exhibiting in galleries nationwide, Marsh now focuses on teaching workshops and creating a line of functional and decorative ceramics inspired by the textures and patterns of everyday life. For more information about our artist talks, please visit our virtual library at baltimoreclayworks.org. I will now turn it over to Shalaya.
Um, Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you all. And thank you for Clayworks for hosting this lecture series. It's just a wonderful thing. Um, I am going to talk today about sources, iteration, and exploration. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that inspire me, the things that I do in my studio all the time, and the way in which those things affect and drive my work, and the development of my work over pretty much the last 20 years. So this is what my work looks like currently. You probably have seen some of this in the Clayworks shop. I'm actually currently drinking out of one of my mugs right here. And this work has evolved over the years. So the first thing I want to show you is this piece. This is always how I start my slideshow. This piece was a really pivotal moment in the development of my work and the development of my own voice. It was made shortly after I finished undergrad. I went to SUNY New Paltz for my undergrad, and when I finished, I didn't really know what to do with myself. In school, they don't really teach you a lot about how to be a functioning working artist. They teach you a lot about how to think about your work and about how to write about your work. But those things didn't really help me to make a career. And so I strove to kind of find a place for myself, and I ended up at a residency at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. And it was a really wonderful experience. I ended up staying there for 2 years, and I finished this piece at the end of my first year for my culminating exhibit there. And it was a line of rattles. So the small forms on the top are pit-fired and Sager-fired rattles that um, I lined up on this brick wall that I built in the gallery, and the wall had a big trough full of sand in front of it. The sand I originally marked with just a couple of impressions from the rattles, and so throughout the course of the exhibition, it took on the the impressions of all of the viewers who came in to see the exhibit. And for me, it was really this point where I was kind of understanding that the pieces that I was making really needed the user to complete them. And so this is the way in which, at this time, that user was completing these pieces. They were also getting this experience because the organic forms could just be sculptures, but once they picked them up, they understood that there was sound and music that was coming from those pieces as well. And my work has always been focused around textures and patterns. I really, really like bringing out the natural ability of the clay to showcase and show us texture and pattern. Um, so these are a few. This is a few. I'm going to show you a few pieces from the time in between um, after my residency. I was working on thinking about, again, that relationship between the user and the pieces. So implying relationships, using color and pattern and form to help strengthen those relationships and the implied use of the pieces. And I was looking at a lot of games and puzzles and things where different pieces fit together. So I really like the way in which the bento box kind of conveys different information when it's empty or when it's full of food, same as the use of functional pieces. of pottery. In addition to looking at those games and toys, I was also looking at books and objects that created rhythm and order and structure. And I was kind of really focused on and interested in the way in which these objects could contain and convey information. And was using this exploration about those objects in order to, again, create these relationships that would imply use within the work. So at that time, uh, I was kind of transitioning out of the residency, and I spent about a year making work in my kitchen. So the work was small scale, and I was driving the work to the kiln, right? I had made a relationship with a um, local studio and was just packing everything up and driving it. So the scale of the work was fairly limited. Um, but I got the opportunity to actually work for the studio where I was firing as their tech. And along with working as their tech, I was mixing glazes and scrubbing toilets and cleaning floors, I was able to have a studio space. And so I had to provide my own clay and glaze materials, but I was able to use the kilns and have a studio that was not in my kitchen. And it really expanded the scale of the work that I was able to make. So this is the first big installation that I made after getting the access to this studio space. And it's really an exploration of positive negative space and the displacement of objects. So um, it was a whole series of objects that had these boxes that they fit perfectly in, and then they would be displaced on the other side of the pieces. It was really about semantics, which is the study of meaning, and it kind of addressed, for me, the way in which words and have they change over time. Um, that idea of the fact that things will change as we are as our culture is changing. And these forms in this piece kind of reference the earliest forms of writing and accounting. So this is just a maquette for that piece. I did a lot of planning, pre-planning for pieces that were this big and installations. And the making a maquette that I could go off of really helped me to work out all the visuals for the pieces because while I wanted them to be conceptually strong, I also felt it was really important for them to be visually strong as and to stand on their own. So these are the tools and tokens I was talking about. This piece is heavily influenced by these. I actually took this picture when I was visiting the Paris, and I was just really attracted to these small items, these tokens. They were really similar to objects that I had been making in my studio, and because of that, I really delved into researching them and found out that they were really the first forms of writing. So the little tokens that you see on the top are uh, just these solid clay pieces that were used to represent things like commodities, so grain or cattle, and they were used to kind of trade when people were doing trade in ancient Mesopotamia, and they kind of evolved over time, and so. Someone realized that they could use the tokens to make textures on clay balls. So the second image that you see is the tokens kind of inside, sealed inside of a clay ball, and you can see the impressions of that clay piece on the outside. Um, so these were used to represent transactions, right? To represent the trade of cattle, of commodities, and they were. The start of real writing because they ended up kind of flattening the pocket out, the envelope out, and impressing those tokens into tablets. And that was the first steps towards pictographs and true cuneiform. Um, and so I really loved the way that these objects had to do with language and the development of language, and how that evolved over time. So you can see that reference to these tokens in these sculptural forms, but also these pieces reference those books that I was showing before and the games and the puzzles, because again, they imply this use. They imply that the pieces could be moved from one spot to another. Um, and I really wanted to, continue to have that viewer interaction with the work, or feel like they could interact with the work in that tangible way. So at this point, I started to feel like the references that I was making were pretty abstract. And I wanted to not only imply this user interaction, but I wanted to provide a real way for the user to interact with the work. Because in the gallery setting, we're discouraged from touching sculpture. It's a little bit different when you're talking about pottery, but still in the gallery setting, typically that interaction that I was implying could only be implied and couldn't actually, the viewer couldn't actually follow through on that in most cases. And so I started to do a lot of research into signs and symbols. And I started to create my own series of signs and symbols that were combinations of these modern and archaic symbols. And so I was seeing these everywhere, right? Symbols are everywhere that we go. And their meaning, like language, is really dependent upon us agreeing upon that meaning. And their meaning can also change over time. So I started to develop a series of monoalphabetic substitutions where a symbol was a direct substitution for a letter in the alphabet. And so in this case, you can see here this is an illuminated substitute. So its name is B031 block. And that B is the illuminated letter, so that that shape that you're seeing that's raised on the tile is the letter B in this cipher that I've developed. And then the tile itself is the definition of block. So I picked the word block here and also used that shape as the letter B because I think that actually looks like the shape that it is actually looks like a building block. And so I'm kind of playing off the shape of the sculptural element being related to the letter and the word that it's actually encoding. And these are based off of research also done into illuminated manuscripts. So, if you're not familiar with illuminated manuscripts, they were these drawings that you can see here that illuminated the first letter in the passage of text that was in a, a book, and it also visually provided the viewer with information about what was going on in the text. So this made writing more accessible to folks who were illiterate and couldn't read because they could see the story and make inferences from the image that was depicted in that illuminated letter of the text. And I really liked the way that information was being encoded into the image. I also work heavily in multiples and serialization. So um, you can see it. I from the previous slides. I tend to make a series of work um, and do a lot of research into particular nitty-gritty little things that I have obsessions about. And then to kind of expand on those and make whole bodies of work that will go together. So a few more pieces from this series of illuminations, but also of using ciphers in the work that I'm making. So in the background, you can see some pieces that are using the same cipher that I was showing you before with the block piece, that substitution cipher. Um, and then in the foreground, you can see a piece that also uses a substitution cipher, but it is combined with a binary code. So these are kind of three-dimensional ones and zeros in this kind of block here. And this piece um, is called Magic. It is based on research that I was doing at the time on more on codes and symbols. So this piece encrypts a passage of text from Japanese diplomatic communiques from World War II. Um, the text itself that is encoded on the sculpture is "Caution must be exercised," and it's taken directly from one of the decoded communiques, but I really like the way in which that snippet of text um, kind of talks about how it's really important that we use caution when we are looking at information without the proper context. So these diplomatic communiques were used to justify the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And so that idea that we really need to use caution, we need to use caution when we're looking at information and to think more and give context to that information in order to really understand what it is all about. Um, Okay, so this is kind of a representation. I'm using a 5-bit binary code for these pieces, ones and zeros. Ones and zeros are kind of how your computer processes information. So the computer can really only understand on and off, the one and the zero. And so every time you press a key on your keyboard, you're actually entering into the computer a series of ones and zeros that it understands and can contextualize as a representation of something else, a letter or a number, or other pieces of information. And I use that code in a lot of different ways. So not only the in the piece that you saw before, but here you can see these ones and zeros as actual shapes of the ones and the zeros. Um, they're kind of like eclairs and donuts, right? I've been watching a lot of baking shows, so now all I can see are eclairs and donuts. Um, but so I'm also like in these pieces again playing with the language. So this is bring into condition by mental preoccupation, you think. And it's actually paired with another piece that I don't have an image of in this slide, but uh, that is similar in terms of the way it talks about uh, the that idea of oh, so it's I dream. So it's you think I dream, and they're a pair that go together. And I like the way that you can kind of twist things apart. So like you think I dream, or I dream you think, which has, if you change them around, have really different kind of meanings. And I really enjoy that kind of play on words and the context that's given. So, I also, at this time, like right after this, got the Lormina Salter Fellowship at Clayworks and came to Clayworks for a year and did a residency. It was a really, really wonderful time. I was looking to expand my community. I felt like I was very much, inside of I had a like 10 by 10 studio, private studio in a community studio at that point. But I didn't have a lot of, there weren't a lot of other people working actively in the studio consistently. And so I wanted that. And so I applied for the fellowship and moved down to Baltimore and continued to work on this series of pieces, the exploration of ciphers. So I kind of dug more into lots of research and specifically into this symbol, which is an X, also known as the diagonal cross with arms of equal length. And it's a really kind of great symbol. I use these like kind of little sketches that I made to um, to actually create a cipher that is actually a font. So I turned it into a font so I could type it on the computer. This like allows me to visualize what a piece of text will look like. And I've done that with most of the coding that I've done. It's kind of a pretty interesting experience to be able to make your own font and then type up words and have it show up, in kind of whirligigs, right? Wingdings. Um, the cipher is here. This is a tile piece with both flat tiles and then three-dimensional tiles. And the ciphers were always exhibited alongside of these pieces so that the viewer could actually decode the pieces of text. And oftentimes I would give out little handouts that had like a visualization of the piece so that people could go around and decipher those pieces of text. But there's always clues as well in the names of the pieces to the ciphers and how things relate to each other. Um, so this piece is the first piece I decoded using this X cipher. Um, and it is a piece that relates really directly to this idea that symbols can have multiple and often contradictory meanings. So some of the simplest signs will have that, like the X itself. Um, the X is a symbol that in our culture means to multiply, but in ancient Egypt it meant to divide. And I love that idea that it's the complete opposite. Thousands of years and culture and context really change what something means entirely. Um, and that context is really important to us understanding the meaning of things. The encoded piece of text here, the law of the polarity of meanings of elementary graphs, is a law, kind of a theory from this linguist. His name was Carl Lingman. And he wrote this book called Thought Signs, The Semiotics of Symbols, which talked a lot about this, about the changing nature of symbols and their meanings throughout history. And it really attracted me, and especially the idea of the X, and that the X had this multiple levels of meanings throughout different cultures. And so this was kind of wrapping up my time at Clayworks. And I started to do a lot of research at the end of that time into color. So all of the work that you've seen so far has been made with earthenware using terra sigillata, mostly white, red, black, yellow. So really earthy tones that relate back to those ancient tokens that I was looking at and kind of relate to the um those um old forms, those weathered surfaces. But I started to want to investigate color, and so started to tint my terra sigillata and play with color as an idea, a conceptual idea, as well. So these are based off of the on-off symbols or power symbols that you see, often on your computers and on electronic devices. This symbol really kind of gets overlooked and not really noticed, but it's a one and a zero. So it goes back to that idea of the binary code and how we put things together. I was also looking at and using color in terms of a coding element. So in this piece, I'm using the color kind of to reference red and green or stop and go. But in these pieces, I'm using the color as a cipher itself. So 26 different colors, each representing a different letter. And then these pieces in this cipher, these are all an alphabet, so they actually are just letter shapes. They're abstractions of letter shapes, but they are scaled to the size of the frequency that the letter is used in English. So the biggest ones, the A, the E, and the T, are the most frequently used letters in the English alphabet. And so you can see all the way down to the very, very unfrequent, Q's and X's here. So using scale and using color also to as elements that can foster code. But I got kind of a little, I wanted to push the work further. And I was actually in graduate school at this time. So pushing the work when you're in graduate school is something that you're always encouraged to do. And so I started to explore the forms of those letters, but even more abstractly. So this actually spells out the word void, but it is only containing the voids of the letters themselves. And so I was really like pushing away from all of the encoding, pushing away from the direct content of those ciphers and pushing into abstraction. And I also removed all of the color because the color seemed to start to be really arbitrary. And so to push away from that, I removed it. I'm still using earthenware at this point and just black and white terra sigillata. Um, but have stripped out all that color and am just using the two tones for the simplicity and also for the like the strong contrast that it provided. But I felt like very detached from the pieces and while removing all of the actual encoding from them. And so I started to look for other sources of inspiration. And at this time, began to do a lot of exploration about knots and tangles. I was really excited by the formal layering that was happening in the pieces that I was making, but needed something else to bring the pieces um, to to connect the pieces a little bit more to the viewer and to connect to the way in which I was kind of feeling. And at this point, I was feeling a lot of tension and distance um, uh, and so I was started to use these knots and tangles in the work. I really liked and switched to porcelain at this time because of the porcelain's associations with like preciousness and value and strength. So it seemed a natural kind of movement away from the earthenware to the porcelain. And also I was just using a red clay body and covering it all over with white and black terra sigillata. It felt much more true to the work to not be covering all that over, but to be using the porcelain as its clay body itself. So I started to do things like remove objects from underneath blankets to create voids and to fill those voids with cut vinyl. So the wall vinyl that you would use to put exhibition text up. And I started to stretch the porcelain really, really thin so that it could take on the shape of what was underneath it. So it could create those negative spaces and voids. And I started to layer things up so that I could be obscuring what was behind different pieces so that I could get the viewer to kind of start to explore the layers and the depth in the pieces. And at this time, I also started to incorporate more digital technology in my work. So most of these pieces start on paper as drawings, but then get scanned into the computer and translated into vectors using Illustrator and such programs. I was doing a little bit of CNC milling on plaster and foam, and also doing a lot of vinyl cutting. So I kind of think of cut vinyl as a gateway drug into digital technology because it's a really easy and approachable way to use digital technology. And I started, and I got my own vinyl cutter. So um, uh, I think I'm now on like vinyl cutter. I have like 4 or 5 vinyl cutters now, but at the time it was a huge investment for me to buy a cutter that I had access to at home. Um, but it allowed me to really play with the idea of those digital forms. Um, and all of this work has really strong associations with my like love for shadows and voids. Um, and here's a piece that I absolutely love by Ruth Duckworth that is a great representation of this, these shadows and voids and these little areas that are tucked away, and that draw the viewer in to kind of explore the work some more. So I was using my vinyl cutter and pairing wall vinyl. So in this image, you can see the gray shapes are shadows. They're shadows of a knot that is no longer present in the work. So I used this knot drawing and then created these shadows of this knot that you can see through the voids on these tile pieces. And I really liked kind of using and pairing the vinyl with the ceramic element to contrast permanence and impermanence. So, the wall vinyl is incredibly temporary, and is I have to remake it for each piece, so it gets ripped off the wall and it's not reusable. Um, and the ceramic element is permanent. So I'm taking something, this knot or tangle, something that we would think of as soft and malleable and something that you could untie, and fixing it in ceramic so that it is no longer something that can be untied. And I really like that contrast between the permanence and the impermanence of the wall vinyl and the knots in porcelain. I also really like manipulating these drawings and of knots and changing them so that aspects of the original are lost, and so that what we're really looking at are impressions of of that original. So this is the same knot form here that you saw in the previous piece, and it's kind of subtly removed the actual tangle, and what you can see are these shadows of the tangle and all of these voids. So again, I'm kind of working on the color and the surface and the texture, visually pulling elements together and pushing them apart. So way back to those early works, thinking about the color and the texture, implying movement and implying relationships, um, and um, Um, and so all of these pieces kind of have that implied relationship between the multiple parts and the layering in the pieces. So I also look and think about absence and presence a lot in my work. This is funny. This is an image from the Kemper Museum in Kansas City. And I've been to that museum probably half a dozen times. And I think I have half a dozen pictures of this same piece on my phone because because every time I go there, I stand in front of it, kind of in awe of um of these voids that are in this piece, and how we fill them in. So how we fill them in physically, but then also how we in our minds fill them in. So when I stand in front of this, I visualize the piece completed. It doesn't even seem like it's missing anything for me. And I love that as a kind of um, element in my work is creating these areas of absence, that the viewer can complete. And absolute genius at doing this was Betty Woodman. So this is one of my favorite pieces from Betty Woodman. I actually had an opportunity when I was an undergrad to go and see her studio in New York City. It was amazing. And I didn't at the time I did not even understand how amazing it was that I was in Betty Woodman's studio, um, and seeing her work and, pillow pictures just like sitting on her side table. Um, but years later, I really grew to appreciate her work and her later works that were much more sculptural, um, and really pushed this idea of absence and presence, the void and shadow, all combining to really create these kind of wonderful installations that were still very pottery based, so very vessel based installations. So, um, the knots and the tangles really developed, and I started making and pushing the idea of these physical manifestations of the cast shadow. I liked the way in which that they gave substance to the objects, but also to things that weren't there. And they um, also implied the passage of time. So in these pieces, I create multiple shadows in multiple colors of vinyl that overlap each other and really kind of mimic the movement of the sun. But also they mimic these moments that are no longer there. Creating an absence through light that's not there. And also kind of covering that up by layering the shadows, but also by layering these knot pieces in front of the shadows. Again, I'm really like interested in that idea of the porcelain being used to fix this knot into something that is can no longer be untied. Um, so I also created a series of these pieces that were 3D printed with a Potter bot. So I'm actually 3D printing these dimensional shadows on the pieces. I really like the idea of giving physical presence to something that is made of light, essentially. And then, there was a global pandemic. So I think that the pandemic affected everyone in a lot of different ways. And for me, um, uh, the pandemic was it was very challenging. I was teaching ceramics and running the digital lab at West Virginia University at the time, and um, and so we had to do all kinds of hybrid teaching, remote teaching, recording, which was really, really difficult in of for programs that were so reliant on physical space and being present in the classroom. And in addition to that, just the stress of the pandemic in general, the stress um, of not knowing what was happening or how this our futures were going to play out really had an effect on my studio practice. And I really stopped making anything at all for about a year. I would go into my studio and it used to be a place where it had been a place where I felt more comfortable than anywhere else. But it became a place where I couldn't be, and a place that made me even kind of more anxious, which I couldn't kind of imagine. But so, and in order to kind of like break through that, I did research because you could probably tell I like to do research, and research has always kind of grounded me and grounded my work. And so I got really heavy into some technical research into printmaking, printing on clay, and a technique called cuir de seca, which kind of translates to dry line. So this is an example of cuir de seca. This piece was printed, so that black line was printed on this dark clay, and then glaze was trailed in between. The black line that's printed in these pieces is a resist. So it's a black pigment. Traditionally, it was manganese. I don't use manganese because it's not very good for your brain. But this is an oil-based printmaking ink. So I create my own screens using my craft cutter actually. So I use heat transfer vinyl and um, um, silk screen material and make my own silk screens so I can screen all these images. And these are all images that I've drawn. And then I'm trailing glaze on there. And along with the research into the printmaking came a lot of research into different glaze and different glaze colors. So I did lots and lots of testing. It grounded me. And I love these pieces. They're very transitional for me. They represent a time of kind of a lot of uneasiness, but also a lot of exploration and growth and change in my work. And so um, I've started to slowly work my way towards making vessels, and was making a bunch of vases along with the wall tiles that I was printing, and using these same cuerda seca techniques on them that could really like accentuate these knot forms, and I where I could play with relationships and space along the form of the vessel. But I was still using porcelain at this time, and the porcelain to me kind of felt really cold, and not quite right for the surfaces that I was developing. And so I made a change to a dark stoneware clay, and started to work entirely on functional work and tile, making a line of functional pieces that were really inspired by my second love, that uh, which is the garden. So in 2020, my husband and I were able to buy a house. And the house has a huge yard, and we have huge vegetable gardens and flower gardens all around the yard. And it was a source of calm and really respite for me during the pandemic. And so I started to take those images that were helping to calm me, and put them on the pots I was making. And I started really making pots because my first job as a young person was working for a production potter here. Um, uh, and so I had always really had this love of pots and had made pots throughout the years, in between my sculptural work. But it seemed a natural fit to take this love of the garden and the my love of making pots, and put them together. So I was um, uh, I told myself that I would make pots until pots no longer made me happy. And what turned out to be true was that the pots continued to make me happy. And I feel very centered in this work. And I feel these connections to all of these other aspects of the work. So, the positive and negative space, the contrast, the absence and presence. I feel like they're still really, really there in these pieces. They just represent themselves and show up in a slightly different way, in a way that allows for the user to interact directly with them and to complete them. Through their use. So the other thing I really love about this series of work is the I'm using a very a glaze that is pretty opaque, but just slightly takes on the warmth of the brown clay. And moves ever so slightly, just enough so that it softens all of these digitally cut stencils. So all of these surfaces are made using starting I start from drawings, and the drawings um, are translated into a digital product either using Illustrator or through Procreate, which is a digital drawing program. And then I'm taking the drawings and putting them into the software for my craft cutter. I have a Cameo, but I also have a Cricut. So those two cutters. So I put them into my software, manipulate them, and scale them, combine them, in order to make a vinyl resist sticker, or a texture plate that I can use in order to create these floral and garden inspired surfaces. Um, I really appreciate you all coming, and encourage you to check out my Instagram and my website.